You know the old saying, don't judge a book by its cover. It's a lesson some people have to learn the hard way, etched into their lives by the acid of public humiliation. Imagine this: a young woman working her fingers to the bone as a waitress in one of New York City's most exclusive restaurants, just trying to make ends meet. Then, a wealthy, arrogant customer decides she's the perfect target for a power trip, a piece of dirt to be scraped off an expensive shoe. The woman screamed, she belittled, and finally, in an act of supreme contempt, she upended a plate of priceless truffle risotto right onto the girl's chest. She thought she was putting an insignificant service worker in her place. But as the creamy rice and parmesan dripped down the waitress's simple uniform, an old man sitting alone in the corner did something unexpected. He didn't shout. He didn't cause a scene. He simply stood up, walked over to the table, and uttered 7 words that shattered the wealthy woman's world into 1,000,000 pieces. That recipe belongs to my late wife. This is the story of Beatrice Vanderbilt's catastrophic mistake and the brutal, slow-burn karma that followed. You are not going to believe how this ends. The autumn chill had begun to bite at the edges of Manhattan, but inside L'Etoile d'Or, it was eternally spring. The air was a carefully curated symphony of roasting duck, melted butter, and the faint, floral notes of $1,000 bouquets. Soft light from crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a golden glow, glinting off polished silver and the diamonds adorning the wrists of the city's elite. This was not just a restaurant, it was a cathedral of cuisine, a 3 Michelin star institution where a reservation was harder to secure than a private audience with the Pope. In a quiet, 2-person booth near the service entrance, Clara Riley moved with an economy of motion that bordered on ballet. At 24, she carried a weight on her shoulders that belied her years. Each perfectly presented plate, each refilled water glass, each polite smile was a small step toward a singular goal: paying for her grandmother's experimental cancer treatment. Her grandmother, Eleanor, was the only family she had left. Eleanor had been a chef herself, not in a place like this, but in a cozy, beloved neighborhood bistro in Queens, and she had poured all her knowledge and passion for food into Clara. This job, with its grueling hours and often demeaning clientele, was a lifeline. The tips were phenomenal, but the pressure was immense. Tonight, Clara was on edge. Gregory, the restaurant's manager, a man whose spine seemed to be made of gelatin, had seated her with the Vanderbilts in Section 3. Beatrice and Richard Vanderbilt were restaurant terrorists. They were infamous among the staff, known for their impossible demands, their sneering condescension, and their habit of complaining about imaginary flaws in the food just to get their $1,000 meal comped. The sommelier you sent over was inadequate, Beatrice Vanderbilt announced, as Clara approached their table, her voice dripping with disdain. Beatrice was a woman sculpted from sharp angles and cold currency, her face a taut mask of expensive surgeries. His description of the Burgundy was pedestrian. I expect poetry for $400 a bottle, not a weather report. I am very sorry to hear that, Mrs. Vanderbilt. I will be sure to pass your feedback along, Clara said, her voice a practiced, placid stream. She knew for a fact that Jean-Pierre was one of the most respected sommeliers in the country. Richard Vanderbilt didn't look up from his phone, where he was scrolling through stock tickers. He was a man who had long ago outsourced his personality to his wife, content to exist as a silent partner in her campaign of casual cruelty. As Clara took their appetizer order, she couldn't help but notice the old man sitting alone in the corner booth, the one usually reserved for VIPs or overflow. He didn't fit the typical L'Etoile d'Or profile. He wore a simple, well-worn tweed jacket over a grey woolen sweater, and his face was a road map of wrinkles that spoke of laughter and long hours in the sun. Not Botox. He was nursing a single glass of scotch and reading a worn paperback, looking more like a retired professor than a titan of industry. He'd been there for an hour, observing the room with quiet, intelligent eyes. He had ordered only a bowl of the consommé, and when Clara had served it, he had thanked her with a genuine warmth that felt like a balm on her frayed nerves. Now, those same eyes were watching the interaction at the Vanderbilts' table. He saw the subtle clenching of Clara's jaw, the forced brightness of her smile, and he saw the undisguised contempt on Beatrice's face. The man was Julian Croft. At 68, he was a ghost in the culinary world he had built. He was the founder, the visionary, the chef who had earned l'Étoile d'Or, its first Michelin star 30 years ago, with his bare hands and revolutionary techniques. The Croft Restaurant Group owned 17 of the most acclaimed restaurants on the planet. But Julian hated the celebrity chef culture. He detested the boardrooms and the branding meetings. Once a year, he would visit his flagship restaurant unannounced, under a false name. Tonight, he was Mr. Gable. To feel its pulse, to ensure the soul he had poured into its foundation hadn't been replaced by sterile corporate efficiency. What he was seeing tonight was making his stomach turn. The evening devolved into a masterclass in misery. Beatrice sent back her seared scallops, claiming they were a fraction of a degree overcooked, a flaw impossible for even a professional chef to detect. She complained that the ambient lighting was giving her a migraine. She insisted Clara replace her silverware after every single bite. Each demand was delivered with a dismissive wave of her hand, as if she were shooing away a fly. Clara endured it all. She thought of Eleanor, frail but smiling in her hospital bed. She thought of the stack of bills on her small kitchen table. She smiled, she apologized, she fetched, she carried. Through it all, Julian Croft watched. He wasn't just observing a rude customer. He was witnessing a systemic failure. He saw his manager, Gregory, rushing over to the Vanderbilts' table, not to defend his staff, but to grovel. "Mrs. Vanderbilt, I am so terribly sorry. Please allow me to personally oversee your entrees." "Anything you desire," Gregory simpered, throwing a venomous glare at Clara over his shoulder, as if this were her fault. Julian felt a cold knot of anger tighten in his gut. This wasn't the restaurant he had built. He had built a place of respect. Respect for the ingredients, respect for the craft, and above all, respect for the people who dedicated their lives to creating a perfect experience. This groveling, this fear, was a cancer. The final act began with the arrival of the main course. For Richard, a perfectly cooked filet mignon. For Beatrice, the restaurant's most legendary dish, the risotto d'or. It was a deceptively simple dish of aquarello rice, aged Parmigiano Reggiano, and a hint of saffron, topped with generous shavings of white Alba truffle. It was the first dish Julian had ever put on the menu, a tribute to his late wife, Isabella, who had given him the recipe on their first anniversary. It was, to him, sacred. Beatrice stared at the plate for a long moment. She picked up her fork, took a single, delicate bite, and then her face twisted into a mask of theatrical disgust. "What is this?" she spat, pushing the plate away. "That is the risotto d'or, madam," Clara said softly, her heart sinking. "Don't be absurd," Beatrice snapped, her voice rising and turning heads at nearby tables. "I have eaten this dish 12 times. This is not it. The texture is wrong. It's grainy. And this saffron," she said, pointing a diamond-tipped finger at the delicate golden threads, "it tastes like dirt. Is this even real saffron? Or did you just run out and send a busboy to the corner bodega for some turmeric? The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. To suggest L'Etoile d'Or would use fake ingredients was the ultimate insult. It was an attack on the very integrity of the establishment. Clara felt a switch flip inside her. It was one thing to insult her, but to insult the food, to insult a dish she knew intimately from the stories her grandmother told. Eleanor had once worked in a kitchen that tried to replicate it. Was different. The memory of her grandmother's voice, describing the painstaking process of steeping the rare Kashmiri saffron threads, the precise temperature, the exact moment to add the cheese, flooded her mind. This wasn't just a job anymore. This was personal. She took a deep breath. "Ma'am," she began, her voice quiet but firm, losing the placating tone. "I can assure you that is 100% authentic Kashmiri saffron. The slightly more earthy note you're detecting isn't a flaw. It's a feature of this year's harvest. The monsoon season was unusually dry in the Pampore region. It concentrated the crocin and saffronol in the stigmas, giving it a more robust, almost peaty flavor profile that Chef Dubois decided to embrace rather than mask." The entire restaurant seemed to fall silent. Diners paused with forks halfway to their mouths. Richard Vanderbilt actually looked up from his phone. Gregory, who was hovering nearby, went pale. A waitress wasn't supposed to lecture a customer. A waitress was supposed to apologize and scurry away. Beatrice Vanderbilt stared at Clara, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure fury. She was not accustomed to being contradicted, especially not by a servant, and certainly not with such articulate precision. The public correction was a humiliation she could not bear. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "You think you can stand there and lecture me, you little... nothing? You probably live in a shoebox in some filthy outer borough, and you have the audacity to talk to me about the terroir of saffron?" "I only meant to explain," Clara started, but she never got to finish. "I'll tell you what I think," Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing through the cavernous dining room. "I think this restaurant has gone to the dogs, hiring ignorant trash like you who think they're food critics." And then, with a movement that was both swift and shockingly violent, she picked up the heavy porcelain plate. "Here's your explanation," she screamed. Time seemed to slow down. Clara saw it coming, but was frozen in place. Beatrice didn't throw it. She lunged forward and deliberately, forcefully, upended the entire plate of risotto down the front of Clara's crisp white uniform. The hot, creamy rice mixture cascaded down her chest, a thick, yellow, humiliating stain. A few stray truffles, worth more than Clara's entire week's salary, fell to the floor with a soft thud. A collective gasp swept through the room. It was an act of such profound disrespect, such utter contempt, that it felt like a physical blow to everyone who witnessed it. Clara stood there, shaking, the warmth of the food seeping through her shirt, tears welling in her eyes. She felt the stares of 100 people burning into her skin. Her professional composure, the armor she wore to survive these nights, had been shattered. All she could think about was the dry cleaning bill she couldn't afford, and the soul-crushing shame of it all. Beatrice stood panting, her chest heaving, a triumphant sneer on her face. She had won. She had put the little girl in her place, but she hadn't noticed the old man in the corner. Julian Croft had seen enough. He placed his napkin neatly on his table, pushed his chair back with a quiet scrape, and stood up. He was not a physically imposing man, but as he walked toward the Vanderbilt's table, he moved with an aura of gravity that pulled all attention toward him. The anger in his eyes was a cold, controlled fire. He didn't look at Beatrice. He didn't look at the mess on the floor. He walked directly to Clara. With a gentleness that was startling in the tense atmosphere, he reached out and took her arm. "Are you all right, my dear?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Clara could only nod, too choked with humiliation to speak. Julian then turned his attention to the table. He ignored the stunned Vanderbilts and the petrified Gregory. He bent down, his old knees creaking slightly, and picked up a single, risotto-coated truffle, shaving from the plush carpet. He brought it to his nose, inhaling its pungent, earthy aroma. He placed it on his tongue, his eyes closing for a brief moment as he tasted it. He then looked directly at Beatrice Vanderbilt, and the entire room held its breath. "The saffron is perfect," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "It has notes of honey, hay, and just a touch of wild mushroom, exactly as it should be from a dry harvest." He paused, his gaze hardening into chips of ice. "And you, madam, have the palate of a goat." Beatrice's jaw dropped. "Who in God's name do you think you are?" she sputtered. Julian Croft finally allowed himself a small, cold smile. He looked past Beatrice, his eyes finding the terrified face of his manager. "Gregory," he said, his voice now booming with command, "remind me, what is my policy on assaulting members of our staff?" Gregory looked from the old man to Beatrice, his mind failing to compute. I don't know you, sir," he stammered. "This is a private matter." "It became my matter when she ruined a perfectly good dish," Julian interrupted, his voice dropping again, becoming dangerously soft. He turned back to Beatrice. "You see, I'm rather protective of it." "It was a gift." "A gift?" Beatrice scoffed, trying to regain her footing. "From who? The chef?" "In a manner of speaking," Julian said. He reached into his tweed jacket and pulled out a simple, worn leather wallet. He didn't pull out a credit card. He produced a single, laminated ID card, the kind issued to senior corporate officers. It had his picture, taken 10 years ago, but still unmistakably him, and beneath it, the words, "Julian Croft, founder and chairman, Croft Restaurant Group." He didn't show it to Beatrice. He held it up for Gregory to see. Gregory's eyes scanned the card. The color drained from his face. He looked from the ID to the old man's weathered face, and a wave of sickening recognition washed over him. His knees literally buckled. Mr. Croft," he whispered, the name coming out like a death rattle. "Oh my God. Mr. Croft." Beatrice heard the name and froze. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. She knew that name. Everyone in this world knew that name. It was etched in gold leaf on the sign outside. It was on the cover of cookbooks and magazines. It was a name synonymous with culinary perfection and unimaginable wealth. Julian finally turned his full, undivided attention to her. The kindly professor was gone, replaced by a titan of industry whose empire she had just defiled. "That recipe," Julian Croft said, his voice low and trembling with a righteous fury that had been simmering for an hour, "belongs to my late wife. You did not just insult my restaurant, madam. You have desecrated a memory. And you have done it on the floor of the house that I built." He took a step closer, his presence seeming to suck the air out of the room. "Now get out." The silence that followed Julian Croft's pronouncement was absolute, a thick, heavy blanket that smothered every other sound in the restaurant. Beatrice Vanderbilt stood as if turned to stone, her face a grotesque mask of disbelief and dawning horror. The name, Croft, was echoing in her mind, a drumbeat of her own social execution. Richard Vanderbilt, for the first time all evening, seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. He finally put his phone away and stood up, his face ashen. "Now, see here," he began, attempting to muster some semblance of authority. "There's been a misunderstanding. My wife, she's not well." Julian Croft's head snapped toward him, his eyes blazing. "Your wife is a bully," he corrected him, his voice cutting through the air like a razor. "And you are an accomplice for sitting by and allowing her to terrorize a young woman who was doing her job with more grace and dignity than either of you have ever displayed. The time for misunderstandings is over." He turned back to his quivering manager. "Gregory, call security. Have Mr. and Mrs. Vanderbilt escorted from the premises. Then go to your office, pack your personal belongings, and leave your key on the desk. Your employment with my company is terminated, effective immediately." "Mr. Croft, please," Gregory begged, tears welling in his eyes. "I have a mortgage, a family." "You have a choice," Julian said, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "And you chose to protect a wealthy customer over the well-being and dignity of your own staff. You allowed this poison to fester in my restaurant. You are a coward, Gregory, and I do not employ cowards." Security, two large men in sharp black suits, who were usually posted discreetly at the entrance, arrived at the table. Their presence was a final, undeniable confirmation of the power shift that had just occurred. Beatrice finally found her voice, a high-pitched, desperate shriek. "You can't do this! We are patrons! We'll sue you! We'll tell everyone what happened here! We'll ruin you!" Julian let out a short, bark-like laugh that held no humor. "Ruin me," he said, gesturing around the opulent dining room. "Madam, look around you. You are a footnote in my ledger. An unpleasant evening. But you are about to discover what it truly means to be ruined." He leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial whisper that only she, Richard, and the security guards could hear. "I own 17 restaurants on 3 continents. I sit on the board of 3 major hotel chains and the city's most influential cultural foundation. By the time I am finished, the only reservation you will be able to get in this town is a table for 2 at a diner in Staten Island. Now, I will say it one last time. Get out of my restaurant." The security guards each took one of Beatrice's arms. She didn't struggle. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by the cold, terrifying certainty of her new reality. As they led her and her silent husband through the dining room, a strange thing happened. One of the diners, a well-known Broadway producer, began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate clap. Then another diner joined in, and another, until the entire room, filled with the city's most powerful people, was erupting in applause. It wasn't for Julian. It was for Clara. It was a spontaneous, collective endorsement of justice served. Beatrice Vanderbilt, the woman who lived for the validation of this very crowd, was being walked out of her favorite restaurant to the sound of their applause for her own humiliation. It was a social death more complete than anything she could have imagined. Once they were gone, an unnatural calm descended. Julian turned his back on the scene, his public display of power finished. His shoulders slumped slightly, the fire in his eyes replaced by a deep weariness. He looked at the mess on the floor, the beautiful risotto wasted, the stain on the carpet, and sighed. Then he looked at Clara, who was still standing by the table, risotto dripping from her uniform, looking utterly lost. He walked over to her, his expression softening. "Come with me," he said gently. He led her away from the prying eyes of the diners, through the swinging doors into the chaotic, clattering world of the kitchen. The moment they entered, the noise died down. Every chef, cook, and dishwasher stopped what they were doing and stared at the legendary founder, their ultimate boss, standing with the young waitress they all knew and liked. Julian ignored them. He led Clara to the small, cramped office at the back. He took a clean kitchen towel from a stack and handed it to her. "I'm so profoundly sorry for what happened out there," he said, his voice filled with a sincerity that brought fresh tears to Clara's eyes. "No one should ever be treated that way. Not in my house. Not anywhere. It's okay," she managed to stammer, wiping at the stain on her shirt. "No, it is not okay," he insisted. "Tell me your name." "Clara. Clara Riley." "Clara," he said, testing the name on his tongue. "What you did out there, defending the dish, explaining the saffron. Where did you learn that?" Clara hesitated. Then the story tumbled out. She told him about her grandmother, Eleanor, the chef from Queens. She told him how Eleanor had taught her to taste, not just to eat. How she had filled her head with stories of ingredients, of harvests, of the magic that happens when heat and time meet respect. Julian listened intently, his head cocked to one side. A flicker of something, interest, excitement, returned to his eyes. He had spent the last 10 years feeling disconnected from the world he had created, surrounded by sycophants and businessmen who spoke of profit margins, not passion. And here, in front of him, covered in his wife's risotto, was a girl who spoke his language. "Your grandmother, she sounds like a remarkable woman," he said quietly. "She is," Clara whispered, thinking of the hospital bills. "She's sick." Julian's expression grew serious. "I see." He was silent for a long moment, 1,000 calculations running through his mind. This wasn't just about righting a wrong anymore. This was about something more. It felt like fate. "Clara," he said, his tone shifting, "go home. Take the rest of the week off, with full pay. And I mean full pay, based on your best ever night of tips. My assistant will call you tomorrow. I want you to come to my corporate headquarters on Monday morning. We have things to discuss." "Discuss?" Clara asked, confused. "Am I being fired?" Julian Croft looked at her, and a genuine warm smile finally broke through his weary facade. "Fired?" he chuckled. "My dear girl, after that performance, I'm not firing you. I think I'm about to hire you for a job you were born to do." He paused, looking her straight in the eye. "But first, I have a war to win." The days that followed were a blur for Clara. True to his word, Julian's assistant had called, arranging a car to pick her up on Monday, and confirming that a sum of money far exceeding her best week's pay had been wired to her account. For the first time in months, she could breathe. She paid the most pressing of her grandmother's medical bills and spent the weekend by Eleanor's bedside, recounting the story in hushed, incredulous tones. Meanwhile, Julian Croft was mobilizing his empire. The Vanderbilts had not gone quietly into the night. Their first move was a classic tactic of the rich and cornered. They went on the offensive with their own narrative. A notorious public relations firm was hired, and within 24 hours, whispers began to circulate in the gossip columns and on society blogs. The headlines were insidious. "Waitress at L'Etoile d'Or has history of instability," sources say. And, did aging chef Julian Croft overreact? Eyewitnesses claim Vanderbilt was provoked. They were trying to paint Clara as an unhinged employee, and Julian as a volatile old man who had bullied a frail, misunderstood woman. On Monday morning, Clara was ushered into a sprawling corner office on the 50th floor of a midtown skyscraper. The view of Central Park was dizzying. Julian Croft sat behind a large mahogany desk, not in his professor's tweed, but in a perfectly tailored suit. He looked every inch the powerful chairman he was. Standing beside him was a sharp, impeccably dressed woman in her late 40s. "Clara, this is Eleanor Vance, my chief counsel," Julian said by way of introduction. She's been handling the fallout. Eleanor Vance shook Clara's hand firmly. It's a pleasure to meet you, Clara. What you've endured is unacceptable, and we are going to make it right. She gestured. The silence that descended after the Vanderbilts' forced exodus was a physical entity, a vacuum that sucked the air from the gilded room. It was broken only by the quiet, methodical clinking of a busboy clearing away the debris of the confrontation. Diners who moments before had been participants in a public shaming now averted their eyes, suddenly fascinated by their wine glasses or the patterns on their plates. The spectacle was over, and they were left with the uncomfortable residue of its raw emotion. Julian Croft paid them no mind. His gaze was fixed on Clara, who stood frozen amidst the wreckage, a solitary island in a sea of silent judgment. The vibrant yellow of the risotto was a violent splash of color against the stark white of her uniform, a brand of humiliation. He saw the tremor in her hands, the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes, and the rigid set of her jaw as she fought to maintain the last vestiges of her composure. In that moment, she was not just a waitress. She was the embodiment of every silent indignity he had allowed to fester in the empire he had built in his wife's name. "Come," he said, his voice softer than anyone in the room had ever heard it. He placed a gentle hand on her elbow, guiding her away from the public eye, through the swinging double doors into the controlled chaos of the kitchen. The clatter of pans and the hiss of the stoves ceased as if a switch had been thrown. 100 eyes turned towards them. They saw the legend, Julian Croft, his face a mask of cold fury, and the young waitress, Clara, stained and trembling. He led her past the rows of stainless steel workstations, past the curious, sympathetic faces of her colleagues, and into the cramped, utilitarian manager's office, Gregory's former office. He closed the door, shutting out the world. He grabbed a stack of clean, pressed linen napkins from a shelf. "Here," he said, handing them to her. "I am inadequate with words to express my regret for what you were just forced to endure." "It's not your fault," she whispered, her voice cracking as she dabbed uselessly at the greasy stain. The words were automatic, the conditioned response of a service worker. "Isn't it?" he countered, his voice raw. "This is my name over the door. The culture of a place flows from the top down. I have been absent, Clara. I've been a ghost in my own house, and in my absence, the rot set in. The fear. The belief that a customer's money is more valuable than an employee's dignity. What happened tonight, that is my fault." He sat heavily in the worn office chair, the weight of years seeming to settle upon him. "Tell me your name." "Clara Riley." "Clara Riley," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "Your impromptu dissertation on the terroir of Kashmiri saffron. It was the most passionate, honest thing I have heard within these walls in a decade. Where does a waitress at L'Étoile d'Or acquire such knowledge?" The question seemed to steady her. The story of her grandmother, Eleanor, spilled out, a torrent of love and memory. She spoke of Eleanor's small bistro in Queens, of hands dusted with flour, of the smell of roasting garlic and fresh basil that was the scent of her childhood. She explained how Eleanor had taught her that every ingredient has a story, a history, a soul. The saffron wasn't just a spice. It was the painstaking labor of farmers in a dry land, a history of trade routes and empires concentrated into a single, fragrant thread. Julian listened, his steepled fingers pressed against his lips, his eyes closed. He was not just hearing about a grandmother, he was hearing a philosophy he thought had died with his Isabella. When Clara's voice trailed off, her throat thick with emotion, as she mentioned Eleanor's illness and the crushing weight of the medical bills, he opened his eyes. The weariness was gone, replaced by a flinty, unnerving clarity. "The world is not a just place, Clara," he said, his voice a low growl. "It does not reward knowledge or dignity. It rewards power, and those who abuse their power must be taught that there is always a greater power. Mrs. Vanderbilt believes she won tonight. She believes she can retreat into her world of privilege, dismiss this as an unpleasantness, and forget your name by morning. She is mistaken." He leaned forward, the intensity in his gaze almost frightening. "Her punishment will not be a lawsuit or a bad review. That is the language of business. Her crime was personal. It was an act of desecration. Therefore, her penance must also be personal. It must be elegant, precise, and absolute. I am not going to ruin her finances. I am going to dismantle her soul." Clara stared at him, a shiver running down her spine. This was a side of the kindly old man she could not have imagined. "You will not return to the dining room tonight," he commanded. "You will go home. My personal driver will take you. You will take the next month off, with full pay. I will calculate it based on the busiest Saturday of the year and triple it. It will be in your account by morning. Use it for your grandmother. Do not argue." He stood, a formidable presence in the small room. "My assistant, Charlotte, will call you in a few days. She will arrange for you to meet with me. We will discuss your future. Because your life as a waitress, Clara Riley, is over." The first inkling Beatrice Vanderbilt had that the world had tilted on its axis came 3 days later. The incident at L'Etoile d'Or had been mortifying, yes, but she and Richard had weathered social storms before. Their strategy was simple: deny, deflect, and deploy their considerable influence. Their PR team was already seeding stories about an emotionally unstable waitress and a senile restaurant owner. It would blow over. Their first attempt to reassert their dominance was a reservation at Ethelgard, the city's most exclusive and notoriously difficult-to-book new restaurant, run by a temperamental wunderkind chef named Alistair Finch. A table there was the ultimate symbol of belonging. Richard had secured it through a direct call to the owner, a man with whom he sat on a museum board. When they arrived, they were not led to the main dining room. They were shown to a small, private room at the back, near the kitchen. It was starkly decorated, with a single, unadorned table. "A private dining experience," the maitre d' said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Chef Finch wishes to prepare a special tasting menu for you himself." Beatrice preened. This was more than she could have hoped for. It was a clear sign that their status was intact. Alistair Finch cooking for them personally was a coup. The first course arrived. It was a single, perfectly seared scallop, resting on a bed of cauliflower puree. It was exquisite. The second course was a delicate consommé with a single handmade tortellini, also perfect. But then the third course came, and the fourth, and the fifth. Each course was a single scallop on cauliflower puree. After the fourth plate, Richard called the maitre d'. "There's been a mistake. We keep receiving the same dish." The maitre d' returned with the same dead-eyed smile. "No mistake, Mr. Vanderbilt. Chef Finch is exploring the theme of consistency tonight." When the seventh scallop arrived, Beatrice felt a surge of her old fury. "This is absurd. I want to see the chef." Alistair Finch, a tall, gaunt man with tattooed arms and the eyes of a zealot, entered the room. He wiped his hands on his apron. "Is there a problem with the food, Mrs. Vanderbilt?" he asked, his voice deceptively mild. "We have been served the same dish 7 times. Are you insane?" she snapped. Finch tilted his head. "I was told you have a particular fondness for repetition. that you enjoy sending things back, claiming they are imperfect when they are, in fact, identical to the last. I am merely trying to give you what you want. I have 3 dozen more scallops, all seared to the exact same internal temperature. We can do this all night, or you can pay your bill and leave." He then added, as a devastating afterthought, "Julian Croft sends his regards." The name hung in the air like poison gas. Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. This wasn't a mistake. It was a message, a meticulously crafted piece of psychological torture. It was only the beginning. A week later, at a charity gala, the catering staff, from a company secretly owned by the Croft Group, seemed to lose every record of her dietary restrictions. While everyone else feasted on lobster and filet mignon, she was served a plate of plain, unseasoned steamed vegetables, a public declaration of her irrelevance. When she tried to book a suite at her favorite hotel in Paris, she was politely informed they were fully booked for the next 5 years. The common thread was always Julian Croft's invisible, omnipotent hand. He wasn't attacking her wealth. He was attacking her identity, which was built entirely on the curated experiences her money could buy. He was turning the very world of luxury she used to wield as a weapon against her. Clara spent the first week in a daze, shuttling between her tiny apartment and the sterile, quiet halls of the cancer ward. The money Julian had deposited was a fantastical sum, enough to cover 3 months of Eleanor's experimental treatment and relieve the suffocating pressure that had been her constant companion for a year. When she told her grandmother what had happened, Eleanor, frail but sharp as ever, had simply squeezed her hand. "There are 2 types of people in a kitchen, my Clara," she had whispered, her voice raspy. "Those who serve the food, and those who serve the memory within the food. That man, Mr. Croft, he understands." The meeting with Julian took place not in his corporate skyscraper, but in the hushed, library-like quiet of his Upper East Side townhouse. The air smelled of old books, lemon oil, and brewing tea. He didn't offer her a job. He presented her with a life plan. "The Croft Group is establishing a new educational grant," he explained, sliding a thick portfolio across a polished mahogany table. "The Isabella Grant. It provides a full scholarship and living stipend for promising individuals in the culinary arts. You will be its first recipient." He had already, without her knowledge, submitted an application in her name to Cornell University's prestigious School of Hotel Administration. He had arranged for private tutors to help her prepare for the entrance exams. "You will study," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But your real education will be with me. You will be my apprentice. When you are not in classes, you will be in my kitchens. You will travel with me. You will learn about wine in Bordeaux, about olive oil in Tuscany, about finance in this very room. I will teach you how to build a menu, how to balance a budget, how to command a room. I will teach you everything Isabella taught me." Clara was overwhelmed, speechless. "Why? I'm nobody, just a waitress." "You are the furthest thing from a nobody," Julian corrected her gently. "You have 2 things that cannot be taught, a palate and a conscience. I am surrounded by people who have neither. They can taste the difference between good and bad, but they cannot taste the difference between good and true. You can. Isabella could. It's a gift. My only sin would be to let it go to waste." He paused, his gaze distant. "This is not charity, Clara. It is my legacy. I am an old man. My empire is a beautiful, intricate machine, but it has no heart. I need to give it one before I go. I believe that heart is you." The next 2 years were a whirlwind of transformation. Clara moved from her cramped apartment in Queens to a comfortable one near the Cornell campus, all arranged by Julian's silent, efficient staff. She attacked her studies with a ferocious hunger, driven by a desperate need to prove Julian's faith in her was not misplaced. She was a sponge, absorbing knowledge on macroeconomics, marketing, and supply chain management. But her real education happened during the summers and holidays. She stood in the damp, ancient cellars of a chateau in Margaux, learning to distinguish the notes of terroir in young wines. She walked through the dusty groves of Sicily with an old olive oil producer, learning how the wind off the sea could change the flavor of the fruit. She spent weeks in the development kitchen of L'Étoile d'Or, not as a waitress, but as a collaborator, working alongside the world's best chefs. She discovered she had an innate talent not just for tasting, but for understanding the architecture of flavor. She could deconstruct a dish in her mind, identify a missing element, or suggest a subtle change that would elevate it from excellent to transcendent. Yet a shadow of unease lingered. She would occasionally hear whispers of what was happening to the Vanderbilts. Richard's business had suffered a catastrophic collapse after several key partners, all friends of Julian's, had mysteriously pulled their funding. They had divorced. Beatrice, she heard, had become a recluse. Julian never spoke of it, but Clara could feel the cold, methodical weight of his revenge unfolding in the background of her new life. She owed him everything, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was the beneficiary of a war whose brutality she couldn't fully comprehend. The beautiful life he was building for her was being fertilized by the ashes of another's. The final confrontation did not happen in a restaurant. It happened on a crisp autumn afternoon in Queens, 3 years after the incident. The Isabella Croft Foundation, with Clara now serving as its executive director, was opening its first community project, a state-of-the-art teaching kitchen and dining hall for underprivileged youth. The location was deliberate, just a few blocks from where Eleanor's bistro had once stood. Eleanor was there, in a wheelchair, her cancer in remission, her eyes bright as she watched her granddaughter, poised and articulate, address the assembled crowd of city officials and journalists. Julian stood at the back, watching Clara with an expression of profound pride. She had become more than his apprentice. She had become the heir to his philosophy. As the ceremony wound down and guests began to tour the new facility, a woman slipped through the crowd, moving with a hesitant, uncertain gait. She was thin, almost gaunt, dressed in simple, anonymous clothes. Her face was bare of makeup, etched with lines of hardship that had nothing to do with age. It was Beatrice Vanderbilt. She did not approach Julian. She walked directly to Clara, stopping a few feet away. "Miss Riley," she said. Her voice was quiet, stripped of its former arrogance. It was simply tired. "I know I have no right to be here. I had to see it. What he built. What you built." Clara felt a knot of pity tighten in her chest. This was not the monster from her memory. This was a broken person. "Mrs. Vanderbilt, please don't call me that. That woman is gone. He made sure of it," she said, with a flicker of old bitterness that was quickly extinguished. "He took everything, the money, the friends, my husband." But that wasn't the worst of it. She looked at Clara, her eyes hollow. "He took my palate. He turned the one thing I thought I understood, the world I used to rule, into my own private hell. For a year, every meal was a punishment, every restaurant a trap. I stopped going out. I stopped eating anything but toast and tea. I became afraid of food." She wrung her hands, a gesture of profound anxiety. "I deserved it. I know that. What I did to you was unforgivable. It came from a place so empty and ugly inside of me. I spent my whole life judging things, the wine, the food, the service, the people. because I had nothing of value inside myself to offer. Judging was the only thing that made me feel powerful. She took a shaky breath. I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm here to ask a question. After all this, how do you learn to taste again? The question was so raw, so unexpected, that it disarmed Clara completely. She looked past Beatrice to where Julian was watching them, his face unreadable. He had won his war so completely that he had not just destroyed his enemy, he had hollowed her out and left her begging for the very thing she had desecrated. Clara looked at her grandmother, smiling peacefully in the autumn sun. She thought of the kitchens in France, the vineyards in Italy, the joy of creating something beautiful and true. She realized in that moment that Julian's victory was incomplete. Destruction was an end. Creation was a beginning. Come with me, Clara said softly. She led Beatrice away from the crowd into the gleaming new teaching kitchen. The air smelled of yeast and chocolate from the morning's baking class. She sat Beatrice down at a simple wooden table. She didn't say a word. She moved through the kitchen with a quiet, practiced grace, gathering a few simple ingredients: a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, a bottle of golden green olive oil from the Sicilian trip, a dish of sea salt, a ripe tomato. She sliced the bread, drizzled it with oil, sprinkled it with salt, and rubbed it with the cut side of the tomato. It was the simplest of meals, peasant food. She placed the plate in front of Beatrice. "This is where you start," Clara said, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't start with truffles and champagne. You start with bread. You taste the work of the baker. You taste the sun in the wheat. You taste the time it took to grow the olives. You stop judging, and you start receiving. You remember that food isn't a weapon. It isn't a status symbol. It's a gift. It's memory." Tears began to stream down Beatrice's face, silent and steady. She picked up the piece of bread with a trembling hand. She put it in her mouth. She closed her eyes. And for the first time in 3 years, she tasted something without fear. She tasted bread. From the doorway, Julian Croft watched. He saw the woman he had set out to annihilate, and the woman he had elevated, sharing a piece of bread in the kitchen, built to honor his wife. He had sought vengeance, a perfect, cold revenge. But Clara, with a simple act of profound and powerful grace, had delivered something far greater, a sliver of redemption. He had won his war of destruction, but she had just won the peace through an act of creation. And he knew, with a certainty that filled the hollow spaces of his own grief, that Isabella would have understood. The recipe for risotto was her memory, but this simple act of feeding a broken soul, was her spirit. And it was, he finally understood, the most triumphant meal his house had ever served.